The clay is cool beneath the conservator's gloved fingers. Fragment K, 8538, is not large, barely 12 centimeters across. A small thing at first glance. A damaged thing. A remnant. Its surface is pressed with wedge-shaped marks, arranged in sections that seem to turn outward from a center, almost like a primitive compass, almost like a wheel, almost like a map that has forgotten how to call itself a map. In the climate-controlled vault of the British Museum, the air is held at a careful 18 degrees Celsius, the temperature judged best for preserving cuneiform tablets that have survived for nearly 3,000 years. The clay endures. The marks endure. And because they endure, the questions endure with them. It is not simply the age of this circular planisphere that unsettles the scholars who study it. It is the precision. The tablet excavated from the ancient Assyrian city of Nineveh among the ruined library of Ashurbanipal appears to depict the night sky divided into 8 sections. Within those sections are star positions. There are annotations. There are motions. There are rising times. There are placements against the horizon. There is order. There is system. There is something more than decoration, more than vague reverence for the heavens. And when researchers compare damaged portions of the tablet to computer reconstructions and to astronomical software capable of calculating ancient skies above Mesopotamia, something unexpected seemed to emerge. The observations aligned. They matched the ancient sky with an accuracy that becomes difficult to wave away once you really sit with it, once you really let it settle. But the deeper trouble does not end there. Because some of the angles implied by the surviving marks suggest something beyond simple watching, not merely standing beneath the sky and recording what was visible from a single point, not merely awe written into clay. The geometry hints at calculation, at triangulation, at coordinate thinking, at reference points, at the possibility that someone somewhere in a world we are told should still have been primitive in these matters was already doing more than observing. Someone may have been mapping. And K8538 is not alone. Across museum collections sit dozens of Mesopotamian tablets filled with star catalogs, planetary observations, celestial divisions, rising times omen series, mathematical sequences tied to the sky. The British Museum holds many. The Louvre preserves fragments of the Enuma, Anu, and Lil. The University of Pennsylvania Museum preserves records from Nippur, that sacred city where temple measurements and celestial order seem to meet in ways that still resist easy explanation. Taken one by one, such tablets can be filed away. Religion, perhaps. Myth in technical clothing. Symbolic sky lore. But taken together, they begin to press on the limits of that explanation. Taken together, they begin to suggest that the Sumerians and those who inherited their knowledge worked within a framework, not a loose tradition, not a scattering of sacred images, a framework, a coordinate system. Not merely this star rises there, and that star sets here, but a structured way of dividing the heavens into zones, assigning stars to pathways, correlating those pathways with observed geography, and preserving that information across multiple cities, separated by long distances. The Muldat Apin Compendium speaks of 3 celestial ways: the path of Anu, the path of Enlil, and the path of Ea. Modern astronomy recognizes the logic immediately equatorial northern and southern celestial bands. The texts themselves do not pause to explain why this division exists. They treat it as already known, already established, already inherited. And then there are the cities. The Sumerian king list opens not with ordinary kings, not with political beginnings in the familiar sense, but with 5 cities said to have existed before the flood swept over the land. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shuruppak. These are not fantasy names placed in a purely symbolic landscape. Archaeology has identified 4 of the 5. Real settlements, real temple centers, real administrative sites, real places in the mud-brick world of southern Mesopotamia. The texts give more than names. They give order, sequence, rulership, descent. Kingship comes down from heaven. Cities are established. Governance is assigned. The language is strikingly formal, matter of fact, not lyrical in the way later myth often is. Administrative, almost. Procedural, almost. As though the texts are not inventing a sacred story from nothing, but preserving a memory in the only vocabulary available to them. And here, slowly, the questions begin to circle back. What if the astronomical texts and the city foundation traditions are not separate bodies of knowledge at all? What if the sky maps and the city lists belong to the same inheritance? What if the 5 antediluvian cities were not simply remembered as holy places, but as nodes in a coordinated settlement network planned with celestial reference in mind? What if the observations written on later tablets were copies of much earlier observations preserved because they were sacred? Yes, but sacred precisely because they were foundational. What if the flood did not erase the memory entirely, only fracture it so that later scribes preserved fragments without fully preserving the world that had first produced them? The Sumerians called certain beings the Anunnaki. For generations that term has been translated, argued over, mystified, pulled into speculation, reduced into metaphor, stretched toward ancient astronaut fantasies, and flattened into purely symbolic readings. But the tablets themselves use the term in ways that are often more concrete than modern retellings admit. The Anunnaki are connected to cities. They establish order. They assign offices. Through the Apkallu, the sages they teach. The tone is often not ecstatic. It is not always mythic in the literary sense. It is frequently administrative. Before we decide too quickly what that means, it is worth pausing over something mainstream archaeology itself accepts without hesitation. Sumerian civilization appears with startling suddenness. By roughly 3500 to 3200 BC, southern Mesopotamia already possesses writing, monumental architecture, mathematics, irrigation, engineering, astronomical awareness, craft, specialization, administrative bureaucracy, legal order. The package is astonishingly complete. And the Sumerians did not describe themselves as inventors of this package. Again and again, they describe themselves as recipients, inheritors, preservers. Their flood traditions reinforce this. In multiple sources, the flood marks a boundary. There are kings before it, with impossibly long reigns in named cities. Then the flood comes. Then kingship descends again. New cities rise into prominence. Time itself seems to change. Chronology contracts. History becomes more familiar, more human, more measurable. But the old knowledge remains threaded through it. So the central question remains, and it returns from another angle, and then another. What if the sky maps were also surveys? What if the 5 pre-flood cities were not just sacred memories, but surviving references to a system once laid out across the land with deliberate care. What if the Anunnaki, whatever the word truly carried in Sumerian understanding, were not abstractions in the modern sense, but the vocabulary of attribution for those who established the order on which later civilization stood? These are not easy questions. They do not come with clean answers. The evidence lies in fragments in museum drawers, in broken tablets, in city mounds under a rocky soil, in copies of copies of copies written centuries after the things they claim to preserve. Some fragments speak of stars, some of city foundations, some of beings descending from heaven to establish order. Modern scholarship sorts them into categories: astronomy, history, mythology. But the Sumerians did not divide them so neatly. For them, perhaps it was all one story. And to understand that story, we have to begin not with our categories, but with their language. With the script pressed into wet clay and somehow carried through millennia, while stone itself often crumbled away. Because before we ask what the tablets mean, we have to understand how meaning survives in clay at all. And once we begin there with signs pressed into mud and knowledge copied long after the language itself had died on human tongues, the mystery only deepens. The language was already old when many of the tablets we possess were written. That fact matters. It matters more than it first seems to. Sumerian had ceased to be a living spoken language long before the first millennium BC scribes of Babylon and Assyria were copying astronomical texts, lexical lists, temple records, and inherited compositions into fresh clay. By then, Sumerian survived as a learned language, a scholarly language, something like Latin in medieval Europe. A dead tongue, and yet not dead. Silent in ordinary speech, but still alive in archives, in temple schools, in the hands of scribes who considered it too important to let vanish. And that is itself a clue. Civilizations do not preserve dead languages with that degree of care unless something in those languages still matters to them. Something practical, something sacred, something authoritative, something foundational. Cuneiform, the writing system used to record Sumerian, developed around 3200 BC, most likely in the city of Uruk. The earliest tablets are not poems or prayers. They are accounts, tallies, sheep, grain, beer rations, labor assignments, allocations. The first preserved writing in human history begins not with abstract philosophy, but with administration. With the need to count, to distribute, to measure, to remember accurately what could not be trusted to memory alone. The signs themselves were made by pressing a cut reed stylus into wet clay, leaving wedge-shaped impressions. Over time, these wedges became a script of astonishing flexibility. At first, many signs represented whole words or ideas. Later, they could also function phonetically, allowing the same script to serve multiple languages. Akkadian, though linguistically unrelated to Sumerian, could be written with the same cuneiform signs. That mattered enormously for preservation. It meant, later, cultures could inherit earlier texts, copy them, translate them, comment on them, teach them. But it also introduced ambiguity. A single sign might carry several possible values depending on context. One sign might mean a god, or sky, or heaven. The famous sign Dingir, often written before divine names, holds all three senses in its shadow. So, when a tablet speaks of the Anunnaki under the sign associated with divinity and heaven, what precisely are we reading? God's heavenly beings, sky-linked powers, a title we no longer fully understand. The original readers would have had a cultural feel for such distinctions. We have fragments, dictionaries, parallels, and the long patience of scholarship. Useful tools, yes, but not perfect ones. The decipherment of cuneiform itself came only in the modern era, and not easily. In the 19th century, Henry Rawlinson copied the trilingual inscription at Behistun in Persia, where Old Persian Elamite and Babylonian appeared side by side. Old Persian became the key. Akkadian began to open. And once Akkadian opened, scholars gained access to a vast literature that had slept in clay for more than 2,000 years. George Smith's translation of a Mesopotamian flood tablet shocked Victorian readers because it seemed to echo Genesis while predating it. But Sumerian remained harder still because it had no living relatives, no direct descendants, no family of sister languages to illuminate its darker corners, and yet it yielded slowly. Ancient bilingual lexical lists helped. Akkadian scribes had themselves studied Sumerian and left behind word lists translations teaching texts. They too had felt the distance. They too had needed guides. That means the preservation of Sumerian was already an ancient scholarly act within antiquity itself. A people preserving the language of a much older people because the old texts still mattered. And what emerged from that work of decipherment was not a corpus made only of myths. This is easy to overlook because modern popular imagination often hears Sumerian tablets and immediately thinks of gods, flood stories, strange beings from heaven, dramatic epics. Those texts do exist, but the overwhelming body of Mesopotamian writing is practical. Lists, contracts, surveys, inventories, legal formulas, omens, astronomical observations, mathematical tables, temple accounts, brick inscriptions, land divisions, lexical exercises, technical instruction, even the compositions we place under the label mythology, often read with a procedural texture that feels unfamiliar if we approach them expecting the looseness of legend. The flood narratives describe measurements, building instructions, sequence of events, named cities, named materials, named actors. The tone is often not dreamlike. It is oddly bureaucratic. One senses not simply imagination, but administration, extending even into the sacred. That matters because it complicates an easy dismissal. If the same scribal culture that records grain rations correctly tracks celestial risings, carefully calculates mathematically, and preserves standardized measures, also speaks matter-of-factly of antediluvian cities. Divine descent and sages who taught civilization. At what point do we decide the record shifts from accuracy into invention? And on what grounds? Because it offends modern categories, because we know where we would draw the line, or because they themselves gave us reasons within the structure of their texts to draw that line there. Most scholars reasonably choose caution. They separate what is verifiable from what is not. This is methodologically sound. It protects historical inquiry from simply collapsing into credulity. But caution has its own danger when it hardens into habit. It can tempt us to assume that where a text becomes strange to us, it becomes unreal. Yet strangeness and unreality are not the same thing. Not in ancient records. Not in any records. Sumerian civilization itself presents this dilemma in an unusually sharp form. The transition from the earlier Ubaid world into literate, urban, mathematically organized Sumer appears abrupt. Villages become cities. Temples swell into monumental architecture. Irrigation becomes systematized. Writing appears. Occupational specialization deepens. Bureaucratic life intensifies. Astronomical order enters the record with confidence rather than with visible fumbling beginnings. It is not that there is no prehistory. There is. But the rate of visible crystallization remains startling. Mainstream explanations emphasize fertile alluvial soils, river systems, surplus agriculture, administrative necessity, and the ecological conditions of southern Mesopotamia. All of that is true. None of it is trivial. But it is also striking that the Sumerians themselves did not narrate their own civilizational emergence in such terms. They did not say, first we discovered this, then we invented that, then we slowly accumulated the rest. They said kingship descended from heaven. They said the sages taught the arts of civilization. They said knowledge was received, preserved, carried through catastrophe. Every culture creates origin stories. Of course it does. That alone proves nothing. But the Sumerian case remains unusual for one reason. The same references recur not only in literary texts, but across technical and administrative contexts as well. Astronomical tablets invoke the ordered paths of Anu and Lil and Ea. King lists include antediluvian sections as part of chronology, not merely as sacred preface. City traditions attribute site selection and sacred order to divine agency. The boundaries between science administration and sacred memory are not where we expect them to be. And that brings us again to the same circling question. If this was merely invented mythology designed to authorize institutions, why does it appear woven through texts whose primary purpose is technical? Why does the astronomical tradition retain these older structures? Why does the language of divine attribution survive inside records built on observable precision? The easy answer is that ancient people simply did not separate religion from empirical life the way modern people do. That is true. But it is not the end of the matter. Because even if religion saturated everything, precision still had to remain precision. A mistaken star position would reveal itself. A failed measure would ruin construction. A false calendar would break agriculture and ritual alike. The scribes knew the difference between functioning and not functioning. Their world depended on it. So perhaps the better question is not when did they stop being accurate and begin being mythical? Perhaps the better question is what did these terms mean within a culture that did not divide reality the way we do? What was an Anunnaki to them? What was a me to them? What was an antediluvian city to them? And if they repeatedly placed these terms alongside real cities, real measures, real stars, real orientation, real chronology, should we not at least admit that they themselves believed they were describing a single continuum of inherited order? That is where the 5 cities, before the flood, begin to matter more than ever. Because once language preservation and technical accuracy are taken seriously, those cities stop feeling like decorative, mythic scenery. They begin to feel like anchor points, geographic anchors, historical anchors, maybe even observational anchors, to see why we have to follow the king list back to its beginning, back before the flood, back to the cities. It insists came first. Before the flood swept over the land, kingship was in 5 cities. That is how the tradition begins. The Sumerian king list survives in multiple versions. Not one perfect text, but several related witnesses, the Weld Blundell Prism in Oxford. manuscripts from Nippur, fragments in collections scattered across museums. They differ in places. They abridge. They vary. But on the opening point, they agree with striking consistency. Before the flood kingship descended from heaven and was established in specific cities in a specific sequence. First Eridu, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. After that comes the flood, and after the flood kingship descends again. The antediluvian section is famous for its impossible reign lengths. Alulim of Eridu rules for 28,800 years. Others reign for spans that seem less like history than mathematics. Scholars have debated these numbers for generations. Symbolic cycles, dynastic totals, sexagesimal exaggerations, mythic time. All of those interpretations remain on the table. But the numbers, strange as they are, have often distracted from something arguably more solid: the cities themselves. Because the cities are not imaginary. Eridu, located at Tel Abu Shahrain in southern Iraq, is one of the most ancient urban sites in Mesopotamia. Its occupational sequence reaches back into the Ubaid period, deep into the 6th millennium BC. Layer after layer of temples rose there over time, each built atop the remains of an earlier sacred structure. The continuity is extraordinary. For the Sumerians, Eridu was the first city, the place where kingship first descended the sacred domain of Enki, Lord of Wisdom and of the freshwater deep called the Abzu. Archaeology does not prove the descent of kingship, but it does confirm something simpler, and perhaps just as important: Eridu was very old and it was sacred very early. Bad Tibira has been associated with Tel al-Madin. Its remains suggest an important urban center. The city's name is often understood as connected with metallurgy, with craftsmen, with copper workers. Whether every nuance of that meaning is secure or not, the association is suggestive. Here again, the city is not simply a name in a story. It belongs to the real geography of southern Mesopotamia. Sippar, near modern Baghdad, was a major religious center, dedicated above all to Utu, the sun god. It yielded thousands of tablets from later periods, and its place in the textual memory of Mesopotamia remained powerful over centuries. Shuruppak, identified with Tel Farah, was a substantial early site and appears in flood tradition as the home of the hero who survives the deluge. Larak remains uncertain, elusive, not yet securely located. But one missing point does not dissolve the pattern formed by the others. And the pattern matters. Look at the distribution of these cities across the alluvial plain. They are not piled together. They are not random. Eridu sits far to the south, near what was once the ancient coastline, or close to it. Bad Tibira and the uncertain Larak occupy the middle range. Shuruppak sits in the central zone. Sippar anchors the north. Spread them on a map, and they do something curious: they define the region. They span the territory that would become the heartland of Sumerian civilization. That may be coincidence. Organic settlement can produce broad distribution, but the distribution also has the character of coverage. As if someone were not merely settling wherever they happen to arrive, but laying out nodes across a workable landscape. A network rather than an accident. Ask the question another way. If you wanted to establish a system of settlements in southern Mesopotamia, what would you need? You would want water access. You would want agricultural reach. You would want communication between centers. You would want spacing sufficient to avoid collapse into a single urban mass while still preserving a shared zone of exchange. You would want some north-south spread to cover the region's environmental gradients. And perhaps if celestial observation mattered to you, you would want slightly different latitudes from which to watch the sky. The 5 cities answer to that logic with unsettling elegance. The Sumerian king list does not spell this out. It does not say, here is our settlement theory, here are our survey protocols, here is our geostrategic design. It simply gives the cities in sequence, gives kingship to them, lets the order stand as though the order itself were already meaningful. And maybe it was. There is another detail worth lingering over. The list treats the movement of kingship almost like transfer between institutions. Eridu falls, kingship goes to Bad Tabira, then on to Larak, then Sippar, then Shurapak. This is not the language of one king wandering aimlessly. It is the language of office, of legitimacy, of a system whose center can shift while the system itself remains intact. In that sense, the king list sounds less like legend and more like memory filtered through sacred political language. And then the flood breaks the sequence. The text's power lies partly in that break. The cities before are not the same as the cities after. Something interrupts continuity. Something forces descent again. But even here, continuity is not destroyed absolutely. Kingship descends again, yes, but it descends into a world that still remembers. A world in which the old order can be named, copied, recited. This has implications beyond political memory. If these cities formed a pre-flood network, and if that network mattered enough to preserve in liturgical, royal, and scholarly tradition, then perhaps the antediluvian cities were not remembered only because they were old, but because they held knowledge. Perhaps each city was not only a sacred center, but also a station within a larger system, a system of measurement, a system of observation, a system of preservation. That possibility becomes harder to ignore when we look at the relationship between these cities and the astronomical texts. The north-south spread of the 5 cities covers several degrees of latitude, not enough to produce radically different skies, but enough to change the appearance of specific stars near the horizon, enough to alter rising and setting angles, enough to change culmination heights, enough to matter if one were trying to gather, compare, refine, and standardize celestial observations over time. An observer in Eridu would not see the southern and northern stars in exactly the same way as an observer in Sippar. The differences would be subtle but real, and subtle differences repeated patiently over generations can become a system. This is where the temptation toward overstatement must be resisted. We do not have tablets saying the 5 antediluvian cities were built as coordinated observatories. No such sentence survives. But we do have a distribution that suits coordination. We do have a civilization obsessed with measurement. We do have temple architecture aligned with celestial order. We do have astronomical texts preserved with immense care. And we do have a memory that these cities belong to a time before a great rupture. Again, the question returns. Were they merely old cities wrapped in sacred memory? Or were they the remaining named points of a much older, planned order? The archaeology cannot yet answer fully. Much of the earliest evidence lies beneath later levels, or has been eroded, or remains unexcavated, or may rest beneath landscapes transformed by shifting rivers and rising sea levels. But what does survive repeatedly points toward standardization. Similar temple forms, similar measurements, similar sacred structures across distance. Enough to make independence look less obvious than inheritance. If the first city, Eridu, really was the city of Enki, in more than symbolic terms, then it also becomes the place from which wisdom, the me and civilizational arts flow outward. That is exactly how later myths remember it. And myths, whatever else they are, often preserve structure after details are lost. So we should not rush. We should stay with the pattern a little longer. 5 cities before the flood. Real cities, ordered cities, spaced cities. Cities that look on the map less like scattered beginnings and more like the bones of a design. And once that thought settles in, the next step becomes unavoidable. We have to examine the sky system itself. Because if the cities formed a network, then the heavens may tell us what kind of network it was. The sky in Mesopotamian thought was not an undivided dome. It was ordered, partitioned, structured. And that structure appears in the text not as speculation, but as an established framework handed down as though it required no defense. The heavens are divided into 3 great paths: the path of Enlil, the path of Anu, and the path of Ea. These divisions appear most clearly in the astronomical tradition preserved in the text known as Mul.Apen, but the conceptual groundwork runs deeper than any single tablet. On the surface, the names are theological. Enlil, Anu, Ea, God's powers, great figures in the Mesopotamian sacred order. But beneath the divine names lies a practical astronomical system. The path of Enlil corresponds to the northern celestial zone. The path of Anu marks the central or equatorial region. The path of Ea belongs to the southern zone. In modern terms, the logic is unmistakable. The sky is being organized according to celestial geometry as seen from Mesopotamian latitudes. That should give us pause, because it means the framework is not arbitrary. It is not simply religious decoration imposed on a random set of stars. The religious names are laid over something observationally real. A northern band, a middle band, a southern band, circumpolar stars, equatorial stars, low southern stars skimming the horizon. The categories emerge from looking carefully, repeatedly, patiently over long stretches of time. And the texts do not present this as discovery in progress. They present it as inherited order. Once again, the same pattern returns. The Sumerians and their inheritors do not narrate a world in which they are inventing the heavens from scratch. They describe themselves as receiving the framework, learning it, preserving it, working within it. The ways are already there, already named, already meaningful. Why does this matter? Because if the heavens were divided into paths in this way, then celestial observation was already operating as a system that could be shared between cities. An observer in one place could communicate with an observer elsewhere using the same conceptual map. A star in the path of Enlil could be identified as belonging to a known zone. Its rising relative to another star could be recorded. Its seasonal appearance could be used calendrically. Precision could travel. Knowledge could circulate. Observation could become institutional. The city network now begins to look different under that light. Eridu in the south, Sippar in the north, the central cities in between, all within a latitudinal spread sufficient to matter for certain observations, not enough to create entirely different skies, no, but enough to give slightly different angular relationships, slightly different horizon behaviors, enough for a culture intent on patient observation to benefit from distributed watching. And distributed watching is exactly what a mature astronomical tradition requires. No single observer sees everything equally well from one place. Not in the ancient world, not without instruments of later sophistication. But multiple sites using common protocols can achieve something far more powerful than isolated watching. They can build a stable observational tradition. They can compare. They can refine. They can preserve patterns across generations. What if that is what these cities did, not as modern observatories in our sense, not with telescopes or modern mathematics, but as temple-centered stations where priests, scribes, and trained specialists kept watch over the heavens for practical ritual and administrative reasons all at once? The practical side is clear enough. Agriculture depends on seasonal timing. Religious festivals depend on calendars. Kingship depends on ordered ritual. Intercalation of lunar months depends on watching the sky carefully enough to keep lunar reckoning aligned with the solar year. None of this is abstract. All of it matters materially. The symbolic side is no less real. A temple aligned to the heavens is also a temple aligned to cosmic order. A city whose ritual calendar follows the stars is a city anchored in divine rhythm. The sacred and the practical are not competing motives here. They are the same motive from different angles. So again, the same question circles back. Did religion produce the astronomy? Or did astronomy receive religious names because it mattered so deeply that it could not be separated from the divine order of the world? The evidence suggests the latter may often be closer to the truth. The divisions make sense astronomically first. Only then, or at least simultaneously, do they carry divine association. The sky is divided because the sky behaves that way to a careful observer in Mesopotamia. The gods are attached to the divisions because the ordered sky belongs to them. This has consequences for how we interpret references to divine establishment. When texts say the ways were established by Anu and Lil and Ea, we do not have to choose crudely between supernatural fantasy and mere poetry. It may be that the language is doing what ancient language often does, attributing practical systems to their highest sacred source, because that is how authority and reality are framed in that culture. But if so, then the authority of the system remains practical and real. It still works. It still organizes observation, and working systems tend to leave traces elsewhere. Temple orientations across Mesopotamia repeatedly show concern with cardinal alignment and celestial reference. We will return to that in detail later, but even here it belongs to the same picture. A people who divide the sky into measured paths do not approach the built environment casually. They orient, they standardize, they reproduce order in stone and mud brick, just as they reproduce it in clay tablets and ritual calendars. The three celestial ways, therefore, may not be merely a sky classification. They may be the conceptual backbone of an entire civilizational order, a way of locating stars, a way of regulating time, a way of linking city and cosmos, a way of remembering that order came from elsewhere, from before, from those first foundations that the texts place before the flood. And that last phrase still hangs over everything, before the flood. Because if the flood is the civilizational boundary, the Sumerians insist it is, then any ordered system carried across that boundary becomes all the more significant. It means preservation. It means continuity through rupture. It means the threefold sky may be older than the tablets that preserve it by centuries, perhaps longer. The more one thinks about it, the more the puzzle sharpens. If the astronomical system is old, how old? If it was copied, what were the originals? If the observations align with earlier skies, then the dates of the surviving tablets, then from whom were they copied? If the 5 cities really formed the earliest remembered network, were they also the earliest remembered observing stations? And if so, why were they remembered, not merely as cities, but as cities of descent? Cities of kingship from heaven. Cities bound up with beings who established order. The usual answer is myth. The usual answer must always be considered, but it does not dissolve the data. It does not make the cities vanish. It does not make the alignments vanish. It does not make the 3 paths of the sky any less elegant, any less practical, any less old. So we move slowly toward the most detailed witness of this celestial order, the compendium itself, the text that gathers the stars into a framework so mature, so calm in its confidence, that it feels less like invention than inheritance. Mul.Apin does not announce itself as a revolutionary text. It does something stranger than that. It behaves as though the system it records already exists. The title comes from its opening words, usually translated with reference to the plow star or constellation. The best-known copies are 1st millennium BC, especially from the Neo-Assyrian period, but the material they preserve is older, much older. Scholars have long recognized that Mul.Apin is a compilation, not a fresh creation of the age in which the surviving tablets were copied. It gathers traditions, observations, lists, intervals, procedures. It preserves. It does not invent from nothing. And what it preserves is astonishing. The text catalogs stars and constellations according to the 3 celestial paths. It records heliacal risings. It links stellar appearances to months and seasons. It includes intervals in days between risings. It preserves methods relevant to the calendar, to agriculture, to ritual timing. It even touches instruments and procedures. The water clock, the sundial, the reckoning of daylight and darkness through the year. This is not myth in any simple sense. This is a working astronomical handbook. Its structure alone tells us much. The stars are not listed randomly. They are grouped by path, by order, by relation, by appearance. The framework is systemic. That word matters. A system does not emerge from one inspired night under the sky. It emerges from repeated observation, comparison, correction, transmission. It emerges from institutional memory. The path of Enlil contains the northern stars and constellations. The path of Anu occupies the central region. The path of Ea includes the southern stars, many low and difficult from Mesopotamian latitudes. Together they form a coherent model of the visible heavens. We can describe this today in geometric terms, but the ancient scribes did not need modern equations to know what repeated observation taught them. They knew the sky sorted itself into these bands. They knew different stars belonged to different zones. They knew the annual cycle could be tracked through their risings. And this is where the precision becomes difficult to ignore. Mul.Apin records intervals between heliacal risings. That means someone observed when one star first appeared before dawn, then counted days until another did the same, then preserved the interval as stable enough to matter. That requires not one season, but many. It requires correction for the drift between lunar months and the solar year. It requires a disciplined relationship between observation and calendar. Why does that matter? Because calendars rule civilization quietly. When to plant, when to harvest, when to levy labor, when to hold festivals, when to begin the month, when to intercalate. Without reliable celestial reckoning, administration drifts. Ritual drifts, agriculture drifts. The text is not an ornament to society, it is a tool for holding society together. And a tool of that sophistication is rarely local in the narrow sense. It wants comparison, it wants distributed observation, it wants multiple horizon lines, multiple watching stations, multiple generations of patient scribes. That is why the 5 cities keep returning to mind. Not because the text explicitly names them as its sources, it does not, but because the observational latitude that best fits portions of the tradition lies in southern Mesopotamia, across the same broad band the antediluvian cities occupy. The data belong to that world, not to Nineveh in the north, where later copies were found, but to the lower Mesopotamian plain, where the older foundations lay. If first millennium scholars were copying older southern observations, then what they inherited may already have been ancient to them. Ancient enough to require reverence. Ancient enough to retain Sumerian authority long after Sumerian ceased to be spoken. Ancient enough to seem like a bequest from before, from the old days, from the first cities, from the time before the flood. Again, slowly, the old questions return. How old is old when the record itself is a copy? How much of the system was preserved because it remained useful, and how much because it was sacred? And if it was sacred because it was useful in the deepest possible civilizational sense, then are we really dealing with separate categories? At all, Mul.Oppen also preserves the relation between celestial order and instrumentation. References to sundials, water clocks, day, lengths, shadow observations, and seasonal calculations point toward a culture in which sky knowledge had already become technical practice. These are not vague symbolic associations. They are procedures, methods, things a trained observer does. A water clock measures time when the sun is absent. A sundial tracks solar motion by shadow. Shadow length itself can reveal cardinal direction and seasonal change. Such things sound simple to us because later civilizations inherited and elaborated them. But simplicity now should not blind us to significance then. These were the beginnings of measured time tied to the heavens. Measured time changes a civilization. It disciplines ritual. It disciplines administration. It disciplines architecture. It disciplines memory. And if time is measured through celestial procedure, then the keepers of that procedure become among the most important people in the city. Temple institutions fit that role almost perfectly. They preserve archives, they train scribes, they sponsor ritual calendars, they stand at the junction of sacred authority and technical need. Their roofs and platforms provide sightlines. Their priests and scholars track celestial events. Their records accumulate, then are copied, then copied again. When later texts attribute astronomical knowledge to gods or to sages of divine commission, they may be describing this whole structure through the language of sacred authority. But there is a deeper tension. Because Mul.Oppen, for all its technical sobriety, still bears traces of divine framing. The paths belong to gods. The order of the heavens belongs to the sacred order. The modern reader is tempted to peel those layers apart, keeping the astronomy and discarding the theology. Yet, the ancient system may not allow such clean surgery. The theology is not necessarily a false shell around a true core. It may be the way the culture names the source of the true core. That distinction matters. If a later civilization inherited a mature system whose real origin it no longer fully understood, sacred attribution would be one of the most natural outcomes imaginable. A system too old to remember clearly becomes a gift from the gods. A text copied from an earlier age becomes antediluvian wisdom. A coordinated network of urban observers becomes the legacy of sages sent by Enki. Whether those attributions are literal is another matter, but as cultural memory they make deep sense. And the thing about cultural memory is that it does not preserve everything evenly. It remembers structure while blurring detail. It preserves authority while losing names. It keeps the paths of the stars, but forgets precisely who first laid them out. It keeps the city sequence, but inflates the rain lengths. It keeps the flood as a dividing wall in time, even when the event itself grows larger than literal chronology can comfortably hold. Mule Apen therefore stands in a curious place. It is both precise and haunted, exact in procedure, uncertain in origin, measurable in content, reverential in tone. A technical manual that seems to know it is also a relic, and relics always invite the same question. From where, from whom, from what deeper horizon of memory did this measured calm of the stars descend? To approach that we have to shift our gaze from the heavens back down to earth, to a clay tablet that tries to depict not only the sky's order, but the world's shape. A map, a small, quiet, unsettling map that suggests the same mind capable of dividing the heavens may also have been trying to survey the land. There is a small tablet in the British Museum, BM9 2687. At first, it seems modest almost to the point of concealment. A clay rectangle, roughly 12 by 8 centimeters, easy to overlook beside more dramatic monuments and better-known inscriptions. But it carries one of the oldest surviving attempts to depict the world as a whole. The so-called Babylonian map of the world. The Imago Mundi. A circular earth surrounded by a ring of water. A disk of land encircled by the bitter river the sea, Babylon marked at the center, the Euphrates running through the middle, regions like Assyria, Elam, and other familiar lands placed in relation to that center. And beyond the circle, beyond the surrounding water, triangular regions extending outward into the unknown. The tablet is often discussed as a schematic cosmological map, part geography and part imagination. That is fair. But the balance between those parts deserves careful attention. Because the inner world is not fantasy. It is recognizably Mesopotamian geography simplified into a symbolic plan. The Euphrates is where it should be in relation to Babylon. Assyria lies to the north, Elam to the east. The mountain lands sit where mountain lands should sit. It is stylized, yes. But stylization is not ignorance. A subway map is stylized too. The existence of such a map tells us something important. The Mesopotamians could think of land from above. They could abstract geography into a whole. They could represent relative positions, not merely narrate travel between places. This is a cognitive move of enormous significance. It is the same kind of abstraction required by astronomy. To think beyond what one sees directly, to model relations spatially, to create a frame in which many points can be placed in order. Again, the same circling question arises. Was the same civilization that mapped the heavens also trying to map the Earth? The evidence suggests yes, at least in principle. The outer regions of the map complicate matters. They are usually treated as mythic zones beyond the known world, and perhaps they are. The accompanying text speaks in strange terms: lands of darkness, distant places, unusual conditions beyond ordinary experience. But even here, as in so many Mesopotamian texts, myth and measurement touch. Distances are given, geographic features are hinted at. The unknown is not left completely unframed. It is not pure fantasy in the manner of decorative monsters placed at map edges for amusement. It is structured strangeness. The distant world still belongs to a measured imagination. Why specify distance to a place if the place is only an invention? That question lingers. The usual answer is that ancient cartographers used cosmological concepts and travel hearsay, together fusing them into symbolic geography. True enough. But the fusion itself matters. It means geography was not merely local. The world could be conceived as a totality, bounded, ordered, represented. And a world so conceived invites methods of placement. How do you know where cities belong relative to one another without seeing them from above? How do you place Babylon, Assyria, Elam, and the sea into one schematic relation? Travel alone gives fragments. But travel plus distance, reckoning plus directional orientation, plus astronomical reference begins to produce something more. This is where celestial surveying re-enters the conversation. The Mesopotamians did not possess later instruments for precise longitude. They did not carry chronometers. But they did know the behavior of shadows. They did know cardinal orientation mattered. They did know the changing heights and positions of celestial bodies. Latitude in rough form can be inferred from solar and stellar behavior. Even if not expressed in modern mathematical language, it can still be operationally useful. Imagine temple observers in different cities recording noon shadows at significant times of year. Imagine horizon-based tracking of star risings. Imagine travel distances preserved in administrative records. Imagine all of this accumulating in temple archives over generations. The result would not be modern cartography, but it would be enough to ground schematic mapping of a region, enough to support relative placement, enough to produce a world disk in which major lands sit where they should. The 5 pre-flood cities now enter this thought once more. If they formed the earliest organized network across southern Mesopotamia, then they also would have formed ideal reference points for regional orientation. A city in the far south, a city in the north, central nodes between. A spread sufficient for comparing celestial observations and for translating those observations into terrestrial relations. A civilization that watched the sky systematically could hardly avoid learning something about the land through the same discipline of orientation. The Sumerian and Babylonian traditions are full of phrases like the 4 quarters or the 4 regions of the world. Modern readers often take these as mere rhetoric for universal kingship, and often they are rhetorical. But rhetoric itself can preserve conceptual structure. 4 quarters imply directional division. Directional division implies orientation. Orientation implies a world thought of as measurable, partitioned, organized. Likewise, the Mesopotamian concept of me those often translated divine decrees or civilizational powers may deserve a more practical hearing. Writing is a me. Kingship is a me. Metalwork, music, ritual, office, truth, warfare, and many other structured capacities are me. What if among these were not only abstract powers, but knowledge systems, technical packages, institutional practices, the know-how that makes complex order possible? In that reading, a map is not just a map. A star catalog is not just a star catalog. A standard cubit is not just a ruler. They are me in the deepest civilizational sense, preserved forms of order, carried and guarded, because life at scale depends on them. The flood traditions make this interpretation even more suggestive. If the antediluvian cities were destroyed or disrupted, and if some portion of their practical order survived, then what would later generations remember? They would remember that kingship came down again, that the arts of civilization had to be restored, that knowledge had once belonged to the old centers. They would mythologize the carriers of that knowledge, yes, but they would also preserve the knowledge itself where possible, because without it, recovery would fail. The world map then begins to look less like a curious, isolated artifact, and more like one expression of a broader Mesopotamian habit, the translation of observed inherited order into compact clay form. A little clay world, a little clay sky, a little clay archive against forgetting. And forgetting is always the danger after catastrophe. That is why the map's outer regions matter, even if they are partly symbolic. They suggest the memory of a world larger than immediate control. Trade had already connected Mesopotamia outward: copper from Oman, lapis from Afghanistan, timber from distant mountains. Information traveled with goods. Reports of strange lands entered the imagination. Some of that information would remain accurate. Some would blur. Some would harden into wonder. But wonder itself may be the residue of damaged accuracy. A land where the sun is not seen. A land beyond the encircling sea. A region of darkness. Pure myth, perhaps, or perhaps distorted memory of distant realities carried by travelers and preserved without full comprehension. The text cannot settle this, but it keeps the possibility open. The more one sits with Mesopotamian evidence, the more difficult it becomes to maintain a comfortable modern separation between accurate local knowledge and purely invented sacred material. The two are too often braided. The map shows that clearly. Real geography at the center, symbolic horizons at the edge. A civilization measuring what it knows, gesturing toward what it does not, and refusing to leave either entirely blank. And once one begins to see that braid, the temple becomes the obvious next place to look. Because if measurement mapping and sacred order were joined, then the temples themselves should embody that union. Their plans, their orientations, their measurements, their claims of divine design. All of that now becomes central. The gods, the texts say, measured the earth. At first that sounds like metaphor. Then you read the building inscriptions more closely, and the metaphor begins to feel strangely concrete. In the late 3rd millennium, BC, Gudea of Lagash undertook the rebuilding of the temple of Ningirsu, the Ninu. The event is described in extraordinary detail on 2 large clay cylinders now in the Louvre. These inscriptions are often approached as royal religious literature, and of course they are that. They invoke divine favor. They cast the project as sacred duty. They recount dreams, omens, ritual interpretations. But they are also something else at the same time. They are a construction record. The design is revealed to Gudea in a dream. The measurements are specified. The orientation matters. The placement of rooms, gates, and structural elements matters. Materials are gathered from named places far away. Cedar from mountain lands. Metals from distant regions. Stone from quarries. Labor is organized. The work proceeds according to exact pattern. The language is reverential, yes, but it is also procedural. The divine plan is not an abstract blessing. It is a plan. Modern readers are inclined to explain this by saying that divine authorship legitimizes royal construction. True. But that explanation, while useful, can be too thin. It risks stripping the text of its own most interesting possibility, that the plan may have been understood as ancient, authoritative, and inherited, preserved in temple tradition, in such a way that to follow it was not merely to improvise under inspiration, but to restore a model already held sacred. This possibility matters because Mesopotamian temples were not only houses of worship, they were archives, schools, economic centers, administrative hubs, places where specialists worked, places where measures were kept, places where records survived. If a civilization wanted to preserve technical order across generations, the temple would be one of the most likely institutions to do it. The measurement system itself shows why. Units of length, area, and volume appear with striking regularity across cities and over long spans of time. The cubit, the ninden, the IQ, and others form a coherent practical framework. A cubit in one city is not supposed to drift wildly from a cubit in another. Standardization has to be maintained somewhere. Someone has to know what the proper measure is. Someone has to teach it, copy it, use it, verify it. Temples are where such continuity naturally lives. Nippur, the city of Enlil, never became the dominant political capital of Sumer, yet it retained extraordinary religious prestige. Kings from many cities sought legitimacy there. That pattern only makes sense if Nippur functioned as something like a central sacred authority, a place where standards of order, ritual, and perhaps practical measurement as well retain special force. Excavations have uncovered precisely made objects interpreted as standards, as well as tablets preserving plans and measurements. The famous map of Nippur, though later than the earliest Sumerian period, shows that city planners and scribes could conceive and render an urban space from above with scale and orientation in mind. Again, the same pattern: measured space, sacred authority, administrative continuity. The temple as custodian of both. Temple orientation deepens the picture. Across Mesopotamia, temples and later ziggurats repeatedly show concern for cardinal directions. They face east or align north-south with notable care. This is not perfect in every case, but it is consistent enough to show intention. An intentional cardinal orientation requires observation. You do not achieve it by casual guesswork. You watch shadows. You note the heavens. You establish true direction through repeated method. Thus, even architecture becomes part of the same chain that links astronomy to city planning. The temple is built according to measured alignment. the city organizes around measured structures. The calendar that regulates temple life depends on measured skies. The archive within the temple preserves measured knowledge. When the texts say the gods established order, they are not speaking into emptiness. The order is visible in brick dimensions, in axes, in plans, in intervals and units. Take Eridu again. Its sequence of temples runs deep into prehistory. Small shrines in the Ubaid period give way over centuries to more substantial sacred structures. Each new building rises atop the remains of the previous one. The place is not abandoned casually. It is maintained, renewed, remembered. This continuity suggests that Eridu's significance was bound to site as well as tradition. The site mattered. The city mattered. The temple mattered. In Sumerian tradition, Eridu is the city of Enki, lord of wisdom, fresh water, and the Abzu. It is the first city, the first foundation, the place where the deep wisdom of civilization wells upward. That may sound symbolic, and surely it is symbolic, but symbols often cling to actual functions. If the earliest preserved technical and sacred standards were associated with Eridu, then Enki's role as source of wisdom becomes more than literary decoration. It becomes the mythic form of institutional memory. Knowledge begins in Eridu. Knowledge flows outward from Eridu. Knowledge survives because Eridu was first. That is how the myths tell it. And the myths may be carrying something structurally true, even where literal details are beyond recovery. Temple building traditions across Mesopotamia also show repeated concern for inherited forms. A temple is not simply any building erected for a god. It is this house in this place under this pattern according to proper measure. Restoration literature repeatedly emphasizes doing it correctly according to old plan, according to proper order. This conservatism is important. It means technical tradition was not infinitely flexible. Innovation existed, of course, but under the pressure of inherited standards. Again and again, we return to inheritance. Not invention, but inheritance. Not spontaneous brilliance everywhere at once, but continuity from older authority. And that continuity becomes especially striking when paired with the Sumerian tradition of the sages, the Apkallu, those figures who carry, teach, transmit, and embody civilizational knowledge. Temples provide the institution. The sages provide the personal agents. One without the other would be incomplete. Together, they create a mechanism by which old knowledge can survive catastrophe and become sacred memory. So, when a text says a god revealed a temple plan, one way to hear it is not as childish fabrication, nor as pure allegory, but as the culture's own description of authoritative design. A plan too old and too important to be treated as merely human improvisation. A plan received, a plan restored, a measured inheritance. The modern world does something similar in quieter form. We rely on standards we did not create, formulas we inherit, units maintained by institutions, technical traditions few users can trace to origin. Most people use such order without knowing where it came from. If those institutions collapsed and survivors rebuilt generations later, the surviving standards might well appear to them as gifts from wiser ancestors, perhaps nearly superhuman ones. Why should the ancient world be different? The temples of Mesopotamia stand at the point where heaven, earth, and institution meet. Measured, oriented, preserved, restored. If the cities formed a network, the temples were its memory. If the heavens were divided into paths, the temples were where those paths were made civilizationally useful. And if wisdom came from before the flood, the temples are where it would most likely have survived. From that threshold, the next figure to enter the story is inevitable. Enki, and with Enki the sages. Because once we ask how knowledge moved from first city to later cities, from old world to recovered world, from divine source to human practice, the tradition of the Apkallu steps directly into view. The sages come before the flood. That is the pattern repeated across the traditions. 7 primordial wise ones. Created by or associated with Ea, the Akkadian name of Enki. Advisors to the earliest kings. Teachers of the arts of civilization. Bearers of knowledge. Sometimes represented as semi-divine, sometimes clothed in fish imagery, sometimes remembered more like priests than monsters, more like culture bearers than miracle workers. However, the details shift. The structure remains constant. They are transmitters. That matters more than any single embellishment. Later Babylonian tradition, especially as preserved by Berossus through Greek intermediaries, gives the most vivid description. The first of the sages, Oannes, emerges from the sea. His body is fish-like, but beneath that appearance, he is also human. He teaches writing sciences, crafts, agriculture, city, life law. By day, he instructs humanity. By night, he returns to the waters. After him come others similarly associated with the deep, each belonging to the primordial age before the flood. The imagery is strange enough that modern readers often dismiss it immediately. Fishmen, sea sages, mythological hybrids, surely fantasy, and perhaps in its preserved form it is. But dismissing the imagery too quickly may mean missing the historical shape beneath it. Eridu, first city of the antediluvian sequence, stood near the ancient coast, or close to it. Enki, its patron, was lord of the Abzu, the deep waters. Teachers associated with Eridu water and wisdom naturally acquire aquatic symbolism. Specialists arriving by boat could easily, in the long memory of tradition, become those who came from the waters. Ritual garb could become fish cloaks in iconography. Institutional identities could become sacred beings. Again, none of this proves literal history behind every mythic figure, but it shows how practical memory can become symbolic without losing its underlying structure. And the structure is consistent, civilization is taught. The Sumerians do not primarily boast that they invented the civilizational package through gradual trial and error. They say it was brought, given, transmitted. Writing, mathematics, construction, ritual, kingship, craft, knowledge, all appear under the sign of inheritance. The Apkallu are the agents of that inheritance. Adapa, perhaps the best-known sage figure, embodies this beautifully. In one tradition, he is a priest of Ea at Eridu, extraordinarily wise, linked to ritual fishing and divine knowledge. He is fully human in the story, yet close enough to the divine order to stand before Anu in heaven. He possesses wisdom, but not immortality. He is mediator. That role feels less like a cartoon mythic being and more like an idealized memory of the learned temple specialist, human, trained, powerful, through knowledge attached to Eridu, sanctioned by Ea. If Adapa can be read that way, then the wider Apkallu tradition becomes easier to approach. Perhaps the 7 sages preserve the memory of specific offices, specific lineages, specific functions attached to the early cities. Not necessarily 7 literal superhuman beings in the way popular retellings imagine, but 7 civilizational transmitters associated with the pre-flood order. This would fit the city sequence well. Each sage is linked in tradition to a king or city. The political ruler reigns. The wise one advises and teaches. Secular and sacred authority move together. City life becomes possible not merely through power, but through order, through the keeping of measures, the reading of signs, the timing of rites, the organization of labor, the building of temples, the preservation of archives. Again, the same theme. Civilization is a package, and the package is handed on. In archaeological terms, that package appears in southern Mesopotamia with a speed that has always troubled simple gradualist narratives. Urban concentration, monumentality, writing, standardization, astronomy, bureaucracy. No single component is impossible, but the integration of the whole remains remarkable. The Apkallu tradition, whatever its mythic embellishments, is a native explanation for how such integration was understood. Trained bearers of wisdom brought the package into cities. It is tempting to say this is just a universal mythic pattern. Many cultures have culture heroes. Prometheus gives fire. Others teach agriculture law or craft. That is true. But the Mesopotamian case remains notable for its administrative texture. The sages are not simply heroic rebels or trickster benefactors. They are linked to specific cities' rulers and institutional knowledge. They belong not only to literary imagination, but to a civilizational memory of transmission. Their connection to the me strengthens this reading. The me are often translated as decrees, powers, ordinances, divine offices, principles of civilization. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, the me can be transferred between cities. That is extraordinary. It implies that what gives a city its cultural power can move. Kingship can move. Craft can move. Music can move. Ritual office can move. Writing can move. The whole story reads less like abstract metaphysics and more like encoded memory of knowledge transfer. If Eridu was the first sacred and intellectual center, then the movement of the me from Eridu to Uruk in myth may preserve a historical intuition. Civilizational authority shifted, not because Eridu never mattered again, but because knowledge and prestige migrated. If flood environmental change, political transformation, or network expansion forced such shifts, the myth expresses them in a language of divine exchange. And once again, the flood stands behind it. The antediluvian sages belong to the world before rupture. After the flood, later specialists exist, but they are no longer the same. Some traditions distinguish clearly between the primordial Apkallu and later human scholars. The first ones are semi-divine, or at least closer to the divine source. The later ones are learned but ordinary. That difference may itself be the memory of loss. Those before the flood had direct access. Those after inherit from texts, fragments, rituals, standards. This is exactly how broken continuity feels. The founders become giants in memory. The preservers become students. The old wisdom remains, but at a distance. And that distance is where myth flourishes. So, what are the Apkallu? Again, there is no final answer. They may be purely mythic figures. They may be idealized projections of priestly roles. They may preserve very old memories of knowledge bearers, whether local or foreign, who established early urban order. They may do all these things at once. Ancient memory is rarely forced into a single box. But whatever else they are, they tell us how Mesopotamian civilization understood itself not as self-generated in simple isolation, but as taught, instructed, initiated into order by wiser agents linked to the earliest cities and to the deep wisdom of Enki. And this returns us inevitably to the larger and more difficult term that hovers above the sages, the Anunnaki. Because if the sages are the transmitters, the Anunnaki are presented as the deeper source, the authority behind the authority. Yet the Anunnaki, too, appear in contexts that resist simple reduction. And to understand why we have to follow the term into the texts, where it moves not as poetry alone, but as agency. The Anunnaki are everywhere in the literature and nowhere neatly explained. That is part of the difficulty. No single text pauses to define the term for us in the way modern readers would like. The ancient audience did not need such a pause. The category was already intelligible to them. It was already part of the furniture of thought. The Anunnaki appear in myths, in underworld texts, in flood narratives, in cosmic order, in relation to major gods, in relation to judgment, in relation to the founding and ordering of cities. The name is usually connected to Anu, the sky god. Offspring of Anu, princely ones, great gods, heaven-linked powers, scholars have worked through the possibilities. But etymology only carries us so far. Function tells us more. The Anunnaki act. They decide. They witness. They judge. They establish. They descend. That is the recurring pattern. In the descent of Inanna, the Anunnaki of the underworld sit as judges. In the flood stories, they witness catastrophe. In creation traditions, they receive assignments in the ordered cosmos. In Atrahasis, the divine world is organized in ways that make human labor and divine labor part of one chain of causation. The Anunnaki are not presented as abstract symbols floating above reality. They are agents within it, and crucially, their agency often touches geography. This is one of the most overlooked features of Mesopotamian religion. The great divine powers are not merely cosmic in a generalized sense. They are attached to cities, Enki to Eridu, Enlil to Nippur, Utu to Sipar, Inanna to Uruk, Nana to Ur, Ningirsu to Lagash. The city is not merely a place that worships a god. It is the god's city. The temple is the god's house. The king rules as steward beneath divine ownership. That means divine descent in city foundation texts can be read at more than one level. At the mythic level, the gods literally establish order. At the political level, the city's legitimacy rests on divine patronage. At the historical memory level, the earliest urban order is being attributed to a source beyond ordinary human initiative. These readings do not exclude one another. Ancient texts often operate in all three registers at once. The Eridu Genesis is especially important here. Though fragmentary, it links creation, the founding of cities' kingship, and the flood into one continuous narrative. Humans are made, cities are established, kingship is assigned. Then the flood comes. It is not structured as separate mythic episodes disconnected from civic memory. It is structured as one history of order, disruption, and renewal. The gods create found establish. The city sequence matters. The flood boundary matters. The continuity matters. Again, the same question returns, but now with greater weight. If the text were only inventing a foundation myth for later institutions, why preserve such specific city structures? Why tie sacred agency to real geography so persistently? Why let the same pattern recur in traditions that also preserve precise calendars, measured buildings, and ordered archives? One answer is that ancient people simply projected divine authority onto every major institution. Again, true, yet still incomplete, because projection alone does not explain the depth of consistency, nor the way technical and sacred traditions keep touching the same old points. A modern comparison may help not as new evidence, but as framing. Suppose a civilization inherits a complex knowledge system from a prior age whose origin is partly forgotten. The survivors or inheritors know the system is real because it works. They know it came from before because the oldest authorities say so. They know the original transmitters were somehow different, wiser, nearer to the source. Over centuries, those transmitters become elevated, then sanctified, then mythologized. The system remains. The personal identities blur. The origin becomes sacred narrative. That is one possible way to hear the Anunnaki traditions. Not as proof of literal supernatural descent, and not as empty invention, but as memory translated into sacred ontology. Another possibility, of course, is that the Anunnaki are wholly divine in the worldview of the texts, and were always meant that way. We should not erase that possibility just because it does not fit modern method. The ancient writers may have meant precisely what they said. But modern historical inquiry cannot affirm that literally. It can only note that the texts speak with consistency and seriousness. And what they speak about is not only heaven, it is order on earth, founding cities, assigning kingship, teaching civilization through subordinate sages, establishing the patterned relationship between sacred office and practical life. This is why reducing the Anunnaki to mythological embellishment can feel insufficient. The term does too much work in the tradition. It names a source, not only of worship, but of order. That source becomes especially intriguing when placed beside the suddenness of Sumerian emergence. Again and again, we return to the same historical discomfort. Writing appears, complex administration appears, urban planning appears, astronomy appears, measurement standardization appears. The Sumerians say these things were given, taught, inherited. Modern scholarship says they developed internally, though, rapidly. The evidence does not compel a supernatural reading, but neither does it fully dissolve the native memory of transmission. Could the Anunnaki preserve the memory of an earlier people? Perhaps. Traders, migrants, founders, specialists whose skills seemed godlike to later generations. That interpretation is speculative but not incoherent. Could the Anunnaki simply be the divine family of heaven, the sacred agents by which Mesopotamians explained the ordered world? Certainly. Could both be entangled in the long life of the tradition? That may be the most honest answer, because traditions do not stay still. A historical memory can become theological. A theological framework can absorb historical traces. A title can become a species of being. A sacred city tradition can carry real geography long after literal details are gone. The Anunnaki may therefore be less a puzzle to solve once and for all than a layer where multiple meanings converge: divine authority, inherited civilizational source, city patronage, cosmic order, antediluvian memory. Still, the chronology presses on the problem from another side. If the Anunnaki belong to the time before the flood, and if the cities before the flood are linked with impossible reign lengths, then perhaps we need to look more closely at time itself in the Sumerian record. Because the deep past in these texts is not merely old, it is stretched, inflated, magnified, and yet it is anchored to specific cities and sequences. Why the answer may not solve the Anunnaki, but it may show us how the Sumerians understood the remoteness of their own beginnings. The reign lengths before the flood are impossible. That is where most modern readers begin and where many stop. A Lulim reigning 28,800 years. Other kings ruling for tens of thousands more. A total antediluvian span in the hundreds of thousands of years. Taken literally in ordinary human terms, the numbers collapse immediately. They cannot stand. So the temptation is to sweep the whole section aside as fiction. But that reaction is too quick, because the impossibility of the numbers does not automatically make the structure meaningless. In fact, the structure may be the very thing we need to pay closest attention to. The Sumerian king list moves in two different temporal registers. Before the flood time is enormous. After the flood time shrinks. At first still inflated, then increasingly familiar. Eventually reigns look human in scale. Decades, fractions of a century. Historical plausibility begins to return. The transition is too abrupt to ignore. What does it mean one interpretation is symbolic numerology? Mesopotamian culture used a sexagesimal system, and large multiples of 60 carry patterned significance. Many of the antediluvian reigns are mathematically elegant in a way that suggests schematic ordering rather than literal bookkeeping. That is persuasive. The numbers may be expressing majesty, antiquity, sacred remoteness. The farther back, the larger the scale. Mythic time needs mythic numbers. A second interpretation suggests unit confusion. Perhaps the years are not years in our sense. Months, seasons, dynastic periods, or other counting units have all been proposed. Such conversions can reduce some of the absurdity, though not all. But even when calculations soften the extremes, the deeper point remains. The antediluvian world is being placed in a different temporal order. A third interpretation, and perhaps the most compelling in narrative terms, is that the flood marks a boundary not just in event, but in knowability. Before the flood lies deep memory without documentation. After the flood begins the world in which records become more anchored, more measurable, more historical, in the narrow sense. The giant reigns express distance. They are not a precise chronology, but a signal this world is older than ordinary memory. That pattern appears elsewhere. Genesis presents patriarchs before the flood, with lifespans stretching toward 1,000 years. Then lifespans decline after the flood. Egyptian traditions place gods and semi-divine rulers before human kings. Other cultures place enormous durations in primordial ages and shorter spans in later historical time. We often call this mythic inflation, and no doubt it is. But mythic inflation can still preserve one important truth. The remote past is remembered as vastly older than the documented present. And in the Sumerian case, that remembered remoteness attaches not to anonymous origins, but to named cities. That matters. If the numbers were pure invention, serving only royal ideology, one might expect the greatest later centers always to dominate the list. But the antediluvian sequence includes places like Larak, hardly the obvious choice for grand retrospective prestige. Uruk, which became monumental in later memory, does not dominate the pre-flood opening. Eridu does. That choice suggests old tradition, not merely later propaganda. Eridu really was old, perhaps the oldest. The list's first city is also archaeology's deepest one. That alignment is important. So perhaps the right way to read the antediluvian chronology is not as nonsense, but as damaged memory of real antiquity expressed through symbolic scale. The cities are real. Their priority may be real. The time assigned to them is exaggerated because the distance to their beginnings exceeded what ordinary chronological memory could comfortably hold. In that sense, the numbers do what numbers often do. In ancient texts, they measure awe as much as duration. And awe is not evidence, but neither is it empty. The Sumerians believed their civilization reached back into a pre-flood order so old that conventional memory could no longer contain it plainly. Kingship had already existed long before the rupture. The old cities already stood. The old wisdom already circulated. The old foundations already mattered. That belief fits with everything else. The tradition tells us that knowledge was inherited, that cities were established under divine order, that sages taught civilization, that the flood interrupted but did not erase the chain. Again, the same pattern, continuity through rupture. The old world is not forgotten, only magnified. The old world is not invented out of nothing, only veiled. The old world becomes larger than history because history no longer reaches it directly. This also explains why the post-flood world feels at once new and not new. Kingship descends again, but it is the same kingship in a different age. Civilization resumes, but on the basis of something already known. The old measures continue. The old celestial order continues. The old city memory continues. Time has broken, but order has not vanished. And that brings us to the flood itself, which modern scholarship often treats as either local river flooding transformed into myth, or as literary borrowing behind biblical tradition. Both matter. But from the internal Sumerian perspective, the flood is neither side note nor decorative catastrophe. It is the axis around which all the rest turns. Before it, one world. After it, another. Not wholly different, but irrevocably divided. If we are to understand why the antediluvian cities matter, why the sages matter, why the Anunnaki matter, we have to examine the flood, as the Sumerians themselves seem to have experienced it in memory, not a moral fable, but a civilizational boundary. Every major Mesopotamian flood narrative agrees on the essential outline. The gods decide destruction must come. One figure is warned. A boat is built according to specification. The waters rise. The old world is swept away. Survival is purchased through obedience, memory, and preservation. Then the waters withdraw, sacrifice is offered, and life resumes under altered conditions. Whether we call the survivor Ziusudra Atrahasis or Utnapishtim depends on the version. Whether the text is Sumerian or Akkadian changes details. But the structure persists with such consistency that it cannot be brushed aside as arbitrary invention. It is one of the central memory forms of Mesopotamian civilization. The Eridu Genesis links creation city founding kingship and the flood in one sequence. Atrahasis frames the flood against the ordering of divine and human labor. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves the story as ancient testimony carried by the immortal survivor. Across these versions, procedural detail remains striking. Boat dimensions, compartments, loading sequences, temporal intervals, landing place, release of birds, sacrifice afterward. These are not sparse symbols. They are remembered operations. Of course, detailed myth can still be myth. Precision alone does not guarantee historicity. But the flood narratives are not isolated literary fantasies. They are joined to the king list to city traditions, to the whole before and after structure of Mesopotamian cultural memory. That makes them harder to dismiss casually. Archaeology complicates things. Excavators found flood deposits at several Mesopotamian sites, but not all from the same date. Shuruppak shows one, Kish another, Uruk another. These look like local river floods, not one universal inundation. On that basis, many scholars conclude the Great Flood is a literary magnification of ordinary Mesopotamian flooding. Again, a reasonable view, but perhaps not the only possible one, because southern Mesopotamia was not shaped only by rivers, it was shaped by the sea. The Persian Gulf in its current form advanced gradually after the end of the last ice age as sea levels rose. What had once been low-lying, habitable land became marsh, then shallow water, then sea. Communities living on those changing margins would not experience this as an abstract geological process. They would experience it as relentless inundation. The world their ancestors knew, disappearing under advancing water. Settlements abandoned, sacred places lost, routes broken, memory compressed into catastrophe. Such a process remembered over generations and eventually retold in narrative form could become exactly what the Mesopotamian flood traditions preserve: one overwhelming deluge that divides all time into before and after. This possibility is especially suggestive in relation to Eridu, the southernmost of the antediluvian cities. Situated near the ancient shoreline, Eridu would have stood at the edge of this environmental transformation. If lower coastal settlements or associated landscapes were lost, Eridu might have become a surviving threshold site, a place where memory of drowned lands remained vivid. Survivors from lower regions could gather there. Knowledge could be consolidated there. Tradition could root there. Again, the pieces do not prove themselves, but they fit. The flood, as sea-level memory, explains why the event becomes civilizational rather than merely local. It explains why the old world is gone, not just damaged. It explains why the tradition insists on continuity of knowledge through selected survival. It explains why cities after the flood are not simply rebuilt copies of the exact old ones, but a shifted network. It explains why the antediluvian order is remembered as foundational and yet inaccessible. And above all, it explains why preservation becomes sacred. Ziusudra, or Atrahasis, does not save only himself. He saves seeds of life, skills, continuity. In some traditions, craftsmen and all living things are part of what must be carried through. That sounds biological, yes, but also civilizational. The flood is not merely a danger to bodies, it is a danger to order, to knowledge, to technique, to measurement, to the calendar, to the archive, to everything that makes a city possible. And if that is so, then the whole Sumerian story begins to align around one central idea. Civilization survived because knowledge was deliberately preserved across rupture. Kingship descended again because the institution could be re-established. The ME could be held because they were not fully lost. The temple standards could continue because they were carried or restored. The stars could still be read because the old frameworks endured. The sages are remembered because they were the human chain by which memory crossed the waters. When you view the evidence from that angle, the apparent suddenness of Sumerian civilization in archaeology begins to look slightly different. Perhaps it was not sheer spontaneous emergence. Perhaps it was recovery, reassembly, reconstitution around surviving centers after older foundations had been disrupted or drowned. The archaeological visibility of cities may belong more clearly to the recovery phase than to the deepest beginnings. Again, not proof, but a coherent possibility. And it is a possibility the Sumerians themselves would probably have recognized. Their texts do not speak as though civilization began cleanly in the visible record. They speak as though something older already existed, already mattered, already stood before the flood, and that the post-flood world was built from what survived. That brings us back once more to the 5 cities. Plotted on the map, they look like nodes in a system. Read through the flood memory, they look like remnants of a lost order. Viewed through the astronomical tradition, they look like ideal reference points for coordinated observation. Seen through temple continuity, they look like repositories of preserved standards. Perhaps none of these readings alone would compel much, but together they create a pressure, a pattern, a sense that the antediluvian cities were not random settlements later decorated with myth, but remembered anchors of a real civilizational network whose full shape has been partly erased. And if that is true, then the final step is to gather all these strands one last time: the cities, the stars, the measurements, the flood, the sages, the Anunnaki. Not to force certainty where none exists, but to see what remains when all the fragments are allowed to stand together. When the 5 antediluvian cities are placed on the land, a pattern emerges. When the celestial paths are placed in the sky, another pattern emerges. When temple measurements, map-making, flood memory, and the traditions of the sages are laid beside them, the patterns begin to echo one another. That is where the unease comes from. Not from one dramatic claim, not from one damaged tablet, not from one fringe theory hoping to survive on shock alone. The unease comes from accumulation, from the way separate fragments begin slowly to align. Eridu in the south, Sippar in the north, central cities between them, a spread that suits territorial coverage and also suits distributed observation. Temples aligned with cosmic order, standardized measures preserved across generations, astronomical texts calm in their technical assurance, yet haunted by reverence for origins older than the tablets themselves. Flood traditions insisting that before and after are not metaphors, but the basic structure of history. Sages who teach civilization. Anunnaki who establish and assign. A civilization that does not present itself as having invented its world from scratch, but as having received, preserved, restored. Any one of these things can be reduced, and often is. The city list becomes mythic preface. The flood becomes local river memory. The sages become culture hero fiction. The Anunnaki become divine symbolism. The astronomy becomes independent native development. The temples become standard products of urban growth. All of those readings can be defended. None is absurd. But once the fragments are considered together, the reductions begin to feel less satisfying than they first seemed, because the coherence remains. The old order remains. The pressure of inheritance remains. So what are we left with? Not certainty. That must be said clearly. We do not possess proof that a coordinated pre-flood scientific network once operated across southern Mesopotamia. We do not possess proof that the Anunnaki were historical visitors, later mythologized. We do not possess proof that submerged settlements in the Gulf will someday transform the whole picture, though they might. We do not possess proof that the Sumerian explanation is literally accurate in every claim it makes. But we do possess the results. The cities were real, the temples were measured, the standards were maintained, the astronomy was sophisticated, the map-making impulse was real, the flood memory was central. And the texts insist in voice after voice that this order came from before. That insistence matters. Modern civilization, too, lives on inherited systems most people do not understand, from first principles. We trust calendars, maps, measurements, engineering standards, symbolic languages, mathematical conventions, all because institutions preserve them and because they work. If a catastrophe shattered those institutions and survivors rebuilt centuries later from fragments, what would they remember? Perhaps that the ancients knew the stars. Perhaps that the old ones measured the earth. Perhaps that knowledge came from beings wiser than ordinary men. Perhaps that what survived seemed so complete, so authoritative, that only sacred language felt equal to its origin. That possibility hangs over the Sumerian record like a quiet afterimage. Maybe the Anunnaki were literally what the texts say, divine beings who descended to establish order. Maybe they were the sacred memory of human transmitters, whose capabilities later generations could only express in divine terms. Maybe they were a convergence of both, in the Sumerian mind, where sacred and practical, heavenly and administrative, never sat cleanly apart. We do not know. And perhaps that is the right place to end, not with solved mystery, but with correctly preserved mystery. The clay tablets remain. K8538 still rests in careful climate. Muldat Apin still preserves its ordered sky. The world map still imagines the earth as a measured whole. Eridu still sleeps beneath Iraqi soil, ancient even by ancient standards. Shurupak still remembers the flood hero. Sippar still stands in the record as city of the sun. The temples still speak in axes, ratios, and foundations. The king list still opens with the old cities and their impossible ages. And the question still returns, as questions of this kind always do not, once, but again and again in different words from different angles. What was inherited here? What was lost? What survived? Who were the sages? What did the Sumerians mean when they spoke of descent from heaven? What did they mean when they treated stars, cities, kingship, and flood as parts of one story? Were they myth makers only? Were they historians in a language we no longer fully know how to hear? Were they both? The mystery endures because the evidence permits more than one reading, but not every reading equally. It permits skepticism, yes. It requires skepticism, but it also requires humility. The ancient world was not simple. and the people who built its first cities were not naive. They watched carefully, counted carefully, measured carefully, preserved carefully. Whatever else they misunderstood, they also understood much that later ages inherited without remembering the full path of transmission. And so perhaps the last lesson is not about proving the Anunnaki one way or another. Perhaps it is about remembering how deep the roots of civilization really are, and how often what survives is not the origin itself, but the form of its preservation. A city mound, a broken prism, a measured foundation, a star list, a flood story, a dead language copied by later hands because it still carried authority. These are the things left to us, and they are enough, perhaps, to keep the question alive. Let it remain there for a moment. Not solved, not closed, only held. Held the way a conservator holds cool clay in gloved hands. Held the way a scribe once held a reed stylus above wet earth. Held the way the first light of dawn holds a star on the edge of disappearance. The paths are still there. The cities are still there. The old names are still there. And somewhere between heaven, earth memory, and flood, the beginning still waits half hidden, asking to be read again.